half a day. Michael Lujan Bevacqua, and this is a re-recording of this week's Fenatsu episode, Chamorro War Survivor Stories, Tulu, Part 3. And so this episode was originally aired live earlier this week, but due to audio issues that made it impossible to hear the first part of the episode, I've decided to re-record it and then re-upload it to YouTube and Facebook so that people can better hear the audio involved. And so this series is a special series that I do through Fenatsu, in which I share different Chamorro war survivor stories. And so there is no shortage of Chamorro war survivor stories. Every year, especially in the month of July, more stories are put out there through the media. Every year, elders are interviewed for school projects, research papers, documentaries. And so there's no shortage of stories out there. But one thing that you'll find, though, is that sometimes the same stories are told by the exact same people. And that there's far more diversity to the experience than oftentimes the usual news accounts or even the usual history books will allow for. And so in Chamorro war survivor stories, I like to talk about lesser known stories, experiences of those that might be different than your average Chamorro experience. Or if it is the experience that is a type of experience that's well known, a story that is common, then we go a little bit deeper into it to understand some of the issues involved. And these Chamorro war survivor stories are something that are very important to me because these are the stories of our elders who endured Japanese occupation for 32 months in World War II. And hearing their stories, sort of gathering their experiences, are so important because they are the stories of Chamorros. They're ours. And so we have an obligation, whether within a family, within a village, as an island, to pass them on. And so I always encourage people to document in their own way, conduct oral history to learn the stories within their family, and then pass them down. And so that is part of what I do in this, is that as a scholar, as a researcher, I have interviewed more than 400 Chamorro elders, almost all of whom experienced the Japanese occupation. And so the stories that I'm going to share with you, though, one thing that I want to highlight, one thing that I want to make clear is that, these stories are not the complete stories about these people. These are stories that are shared in a particular form. And so there's always more to the story than what is shared. And also, sort of even what is shared, it may be important to highlight it, to recognize it, but it also may be only part of that person's story that they're sharing. And maybe later they may have told the story a little bit differently as they changed and as their relationship to their experience changed, as their identity changed, right? And so I want to point that out, though, because I will be sharing the stories and in the voices of reading accounts, things that Chamorros have said in telling their stories. But I don't want anyone to think that in what I'm sharing is their whole story, is meant to represent all of their experiences, right? I will share with you sort of what I have found as somebody who gets to work at the Guam Museum, got to teach Chamorro culture, language, and history for 10 years at the University of Guam, and has gotten to spend time in archives, going through things, collecting things. So, this is part of me sharing what I have learned, wanting to find ways to get it out to the community so that it doesn't just stay in my notebook, doesn't just stay in folders in my house, doesn't just stay in my mind, but that it can go out there to more people to be heard. And so with those disclaimers in mind, we're going to talk about a few different stories on today's episode. First off, we're going to talk about si Pedro Guerrero Cruz, si Tun Pedang. And so in terms of Chamorros whose faces and whose stories are iconic in the World War II experience, Pedro Cruz's is the key story. His face and his voice are key in terms of shaping our understanding of the beginning of the war. Pedro Cruz was part of the Insular Guard. This was, and he fought along with some others against the Japanese in a very short battle in the Plaza de España in the early or morning hours of December 10th, 1941. And so his story of courage, of sacrifice, and of patriotism to the United States is something that is meant to stand in for sort of the experiences of so many Chamorros. But as we will discuss, it is more complicated than that. But I do want to acknowledge that in terms of all the stories I'm going to tell you today, Pedro Cruz's story is the one in which there is a lot more that could be said. And if people are interested in learning more about the Insular Guard, I'd be happy to talk about it. I love to talk about it. I had the privilege of sitting down and spending a day with Pedro Cruz before he passed away. And I did get to interview several other Insular Guardsmen. And so if people would like to know more about that, I would love to include that. Put in a comment in which sort of, and say that you would like to hear more about that. And then I know for a future episode of Chamorro War Survivor Stories. So before we get to Pedro Cruz, though, and his specific experiences, deberita discuti esti, what is the Insular Guard? How is the Insular Guard? And so prior to World War II, hundreds of Chamorros had joined the U.S. Navy and left the island. The Insular Guard was sort of an irregular Navy, part of the U.S. Navy, in which Chamorros joined the Navy, but they didn't leave the island. They weren't trained to go and serve on ships elsewhere. Chamorros would be teased at that time. You know, you join the Navy to see the world. But the Insular Guard was not that. They stayed on island. They did certain menial tasks for the U.S. Navy. They might be, for example, just be like sentries around Hagåtña. They received minimal training. They were paid far less than their white counterparts in the Navy. And so the Insular Guard was at least 100 Chamorro men who, who were there when the war, when World War II came to Guam. And so Japanese bombs fall on Guam on December 8th, 1941. The invasion proper begins 2 days later, early in the morning, and the Insular Guard, along with other U.S. Navy sailors, are called forth to defend the island. They're called to the Plaza de España, which was the seat of American power, the governor's palace, created by the Spanish and then used by the Americans. That was where the Navy governor was, and that would be sort of where the last stand of the United States would be. And so Pedro Cruz and other Insular Guardsmen received the call to show up and to fight the Japanese, to defend the island against them. And so in the darkness that morning, Pedro Cruz, along with 2 other Chamorro men in the Insular Guard, received machine guns that they were not necessarily trained to use, and they were told to familiarize themselves with them and then prepare for a fight. Now, these statements right here come from Pedro Cruz himself, as recorded by the late Tony Palomo in his book, Island in Agony. And so Cruz says, I had one of 6 .45 caliber pistols. I unhitched the pistol belt and gave it to Ben, telling him to use the pistol only to keep the Japanese occupied while I reloaded the machine gun. And so Ben was another Insular Guardsman who had been who had volunteered to be with Pedro Cruz on his machine gun to fight the Japanese when they entered the plaza. You can just realize how I felt during these tense moments. There we were, none of us ever having fired the machine gun, and we knew definitely that the enemy was coming and that we had to face him. I prayed and prayed like I never prayed before. I was scared, knowing that if I weren't in the Guard, I wouldn't have had such a responsibility. And so what Pedro Cruz says there is very telling, that these Insular Guardsmen were being asked to fight on behalf of the United States to defend an island that the United States had taken and was theirs. And so it put them in a difficult position, because even the governor at that time had told his Chamorro friends not to resist the Japanese. Pedro Martinez, who was a prominent businessman, asked Governor McMillan himself directly, and Governor McMillan said, "Don't fight the Japanese. Let the Americans fight the Japanese. Just survive." For the Insular Guardsmen, their position was very complicated, because they were not given training sort of in war. They were not in their own way taken seriously by the US Navy itself. And they were in the morning of December 10th being given weapons that they had not been trained to use. And to make matters worse, some of them were given weapons to fight that did not work, or that were only used for training. So that some of the guns that the Insular Guardsmen received had stamps on that said, "Warning, do not fire," for training purposes only. And so we'll get to that a little bit later in terms of sort of the position of the Insular Guard. But Pedro Cruz is our focus. And so he has been called forth, into the Plaza de España. He has been given a machine gun. He has set up and he is getting ready. Now, there was no chance that the Americans could defend the island against the Japanese. They had 1/10 of the force that the Japanese had. And the Japanese had forces who were battle ready, battle tested, many of them. The United States had nothing like that. And so it was a hopeless fight. So this Battle of the Plaza was meant to be a token defense, and that as soon as the signal was given, the Insular Guardsmen and others were to put down their arms, to run, to surrender, etc. And so Cruz continues. He says, "Chief Lane later instructed the machine gunners not to open fire until we did." So Pedro Cruz, him and his team were set up to be the first ones. During the long silence, the Japanese were sneaking into the plaza area. I was frightened when I heard the sound of metal hitting an object like a water canteen. Then I saw some figures moving, and I opened fire. I ceased to be afraid. And so there in the plaza, now Pedro Cruz, not trained for this. And remember, this is a time when the United States does not talk to Chamorros like they are part of the same thing. They treat Chamorros as they are less in just about every single way that you can. And so for Pedro Cruz to kind of be willing to fight in this moment for the United States, which has not treated him very well, is telling about what he believed in and what he was doing. And you hear that from him. And so part of the issue involved here, of course, is that as the Japanese are moving closer to the plaza, they have, as you can see from the quote here, they've attacked Chamorro families that they see running. They've shot into buildings. They've so that there's all these rumors about what's going on around the island. And so different people have come to the plaza seeking information, seeking to find out what's going on, and also seeking to help fight. So for example, there was a young Chamorro named Roman Camacho, who was also a photographer. And so he had come to help Pedro Cruz in the plaza fight the Japanese. And Pedro Cruz himself said that the boy had seen too many war movies and that he wanted to be close to the action. And Roman is one of those Chamorros in the plaza who is shot and killed. Pedro Cruz continued to fire at the Japanese until his gun jammed and he was not able to reload it. Eventually, Lane told them to retreat, and they went to an area next to the governor's palace where they abandoned their weapons. His only thought during this time was, if I must die, then he hoped he killed some Japanese. And so, let us hear in the voice of Pedro Cruz himself when he was interviewed for a documentary, Liberation 40, and then a later updated Liberation 50 made by Annette Donner. Nita Ekung.
Believe me, even now, I'm patriotic to the extent of whenever I hear that Star Spangled Banner playing in television or heard in radio, I have tears all over me up to this day. I don't know whether you call that patriotism, but I'm saying I did my best for my country. My willingness will never be exhausted, my dear lady, to die for my country. I'm not saying this because of what happened here. I'm only saying this that Chamorus feel like I do would die for our country anytime.
Pedro Cruz's experiences are important because they become a very standard narrative for Chamorros after the war. But one of the reasons why the Plaza defenders, the Insular Guard, their story is so much more complicated and oftentimes reduced and simplified to just the story of Pedro Cruz himself, is because not all Chamorros felt like he did. And so if you go to this monument here for the Plaza defenders, the Insular Guardsmen, you'll see the names of more than 100 Chamorros who were in the Insular Guard. The reality of this fight, though, is that many of those Chamorros on that morning of December 10th chose not to fight and die for the United States. Heeding what the Governor McMillan had told Pedro Martinez, let America fight Japan, just survive. Many Chamorros took that to heart, and they said, I'm not going to die for a country that pays me less, that treats me like this, that doesn't respect me. I would much rather go, and especially not for a fight that can't be won. I'm going to go and protect my families. And so this became something that even when I talked to Pedro Cruz, it was something that was very difficult and painful for him because his story had come to stand in for the Plaza defenders in general, even when so many of them did not fight, chose not to fight. And their decision in 1941 made perfect sense. In 1944, though, after the war was over, that decision seemed cowardly, because by 1944, lots of Chamorros were ready to serve the United States. And Chamorros were more ready to say America was their country because the previous discrimination and colonial experiences were washed away, sort of in the Japanese occupation, or at least lessened for most Chamorros. And so one of the struggles of this, though, then was that for those Chamorros who came to the Plaza who were not in the military but died fighting, one of the things was that Pedro Cruz wanted recognition for them. But because so many of the Insular Guardsmen did not fight, ran, and did not want to admit it for fear that they would look unpatriotic or cowardly in post-war Guam, it was difficult to get recognition for those who died in the Plaza, who were not in the military, who were not in the Insular Guard. And so I remember when I talked to him, that was one of the things that he was frustrated about, is wanting recognition for everybody who fought there, but many of those that he had served with not wanting to testify or come out for fear of revealing the choice that they had made, which is understandable in 1941, but seems unpatriotic in 1944. And so, as I said, comment and let me know if you would like to know more about the Plaza defenders, because I had a chance to sit down and talk to several of them. It's an interesting sort of story. All right, let's move on to the next one now. Dr. Rosa Roberto Carter, who was the first ever Chamorro woman to serve as the president of the University of Guam. I say this, though, because a second Chamorro woman has been chosen recently to serve as the president of UOG. And so the story that you are about to hear from Dr. Carter comes from her testimony before the Guam War Claims Commission in the early 2000s. And so this was a time Robert Underwood was, war reparations had stalled as a movement in Congress in the 90s, and Robert Underwood, as a way of trying to restart it, had gotten a commission funded to study the issue to make a recommendation. And so during that process, different Chamorros, including Dr. Carter, came to testify about their experience, and that commission was successful. It recommended that reparations were deserved or should be awarded. And so here is her story, coming as a young woman of only just 12 years old when the war started. She says, "When Japan occupied Guam 62 years ago, I was 12 years old, the oldest child in our family. My mother would have another child during the occupation, and her last one after the war, for a total of 9 of us who made it through childhood. In regard to physical damage from the war, I am sure the effects of malnutrition on my parents, as well as 9 of us kids, was severe in both the near term and over the following years. There's no way to know all of the negative effects of the 2 years of malnutrition we were forced to experience during the occupation, during which the occupiers confiscated our food for themselves. In the last 2 weeks, they forced us into more difficult situations involving a forced march and virtual imprisonment in a squalid camp where there was no food at all. We older kids foraged for our family, searching wild lands for many miles. We nearly starved to death at that time. In regard to immediately visible physical damage, most of us suffered wounds from being forced into the jungle, where we contacted scarring napalm from the United States bombing of the Japanese. When the bombing stopped, we were forced to go back to clearing bushes, which were dripping with this napalm. And in a proper setting, I could show you some of my scars, which have irritated me for 60 years. One of my brothers lost parts of 2 fingers as well from the live ammunition scattered over so much of Guam after the fighting in 1944. At one time, I found myself clinging to a large breadfruit tree while American planes attacked. Human limbs, arms, and legs flew through the air on their own. People screamed in the grip of hysteria. I saw people going berserk. My own forced labor consisted at first of clearing fields in the Manguilao area. My brother Juan was also forced to do this too. At this time, I was singled out by the Japanese soldiers, locked up in a tiny room at the old Price Elementary School house, and interrogated about my loyalty to the United States. It may have had something to do with my slightly lighter skin color, but the terrifying experience is still vivid in my mind. Also at this time, I was given the extra duty of carrying their lunches to Japanese soldiers located at the present site of the Father Dueñas Memorial School. Our forced march started for me late one afternoon when my brother and I returned from working in the fields to find my parents and siblings loading our bull cart with as much food and personal belongings as possible. People congregated at the Manguilao school areas where the trek to Menengan concentration camp started around twilight. We trudged along foot all night. Weak people fell by the wayside. I do not know what happened to them. In regard to the constant terror of being an occupied people, earlier in Manguilao, many of us were forced to line up in orderly rows to witness the beating of a family for the crime of trying to hide some of its food from the Japanese occupiers. If we showed any emotion, we could have been beaten too. We practiced a code of silence because that means collaborators might be anywhere at any time. Near the end of the war out here in Guam, because Chamorro men were being forced to the front lines where they were to be sacrificed as human targets, my father went into hiding. As a survivor, immediately he led his entire family back to Manguilao. The regimentation of our lives extended to digging our own graves in the last days at Menengan. One of the many things to unpack there, but one of the things to remember is that while the Japanese were brutal and terrible, no doubt we will be learning a lot more about it. An unknown number of Chamorros were hurt in the American bombing, which preceded their reinvasion. And so it's one of those things that's much more difficult for people to talk about because America's the heroes in the story, right? They're the good guys. They save the day. And so then it's hard to reconcile those who were killed by American bombs or shot down by American pilots because they were mistaken for Japanese or assumed to be Japanese. And so she highlights that, and it's interesting because this does not absolve the Japanese of anything. But she also feels the need to mention the fact that when war was rained down upon the island, even those who were supposed to kill the enemy also hurt the people in the way that the war was prosecuted. And so Dr. Carter was only 12 years old when the war broke out. And so we're going to listen to the story now of another Chamorro who was just about 13 years old when the war began, Jesus Camacho Babauta. And this interview comes from Joint Region Marianas, where they have a number of interviews on their YouTube page featuring Chamorro war survivors.
Jesus Babauta lived in Sumai when his life and all the lives of Chamorros living on Guam changed dramatically. It was the beginning of World War II in the Pacific. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked Guam. It was on this day that Babauta, a young boy, was forced to become a man, faced with the brutality of war.
They don't bomb any other place but Sumai, the Standard Oil. That's where they bomb. And when and when they bomb the Standard Oil, because they're looking the plane, they're very nice plane. The Japanese, they don't know. They don't know what a war is until when they drop the bomb in Standard Oil, say, oh, we're in war. And who's fighting, Nobody's fighting, only the Japanese drop the bomb in the Standard Oil. Then right in there, they drop another bomb right there in the Pan American. Then they drop another bomb up there, the Marine Barracks. Then the people, they're all over the place, they run. And they never come back. Since that. So when the Japanese land, they register, they register the people, and they tell you to work for the Japanese. I work in the air base. Down there, Dory Point. There's an air base in the Japanese built up that with a hand and one bulldozer. I was 14 years old. They let you work. 14 years old, they let you work on that time. So the Japanese don't care. You're not that they work, but they don't give us any food. When we're working for the, for the airfield down there, because I was working. Boy, a lot of times the Japanese, they say, hayaku to me because I'm too slow, because the wheelbarrow is heavy. And hayaku. I said, okay, thank you. But they don't kill me.
Babauta and his family were told to leave their home and relocate to Menengan during the time where the people of Guam are going hungry and scavenging for anything to eat. Babauta goes with his cousin Tommy Camacho to look for food. However, during this venture out resulted in their capture by Japanese forces. Babauta, along with his cousin, are brought to Fena. While he was being held there, Babauta overheard a conversation between the Japanese soldiers.
I heard the Japanese that they're gonna kill us, right? You say that Jembu, Toming Sino, Jembu, Imma, Kumbang. Means Imma today, Kumbang means tonight, to kill us.
After hearing this conversation, Babauta goes to his cousin and planned for their escape. Once they got away from certain death, Babauta and his cousin made their way back to Menengan. Once there, Japanese soldiers took him and his cousin again and brought them up to the Jotnya church where the Japanese soldiers were gathering Chamorro people to march them up to Jigo. Babauta and Camacho were told to march from Jotnya to Jigo at 4 o'clock in the morning. As they were crossing the bridge at Pago Bay, there was a delay at the front of the line.
After we crossed the bridge over to the right, the Japanese holler, hayaku, Hayako. So Tommy said, wait a minute. So the Japanese went up to see how come it's delay up there, no? My cousin grabbed my hand and said, let's go this way. We got to get away from the Japanese. We start walking. Somebody holler, oh, who goes there? And Tommy said, Chamoru. So we went out there, and 4 or 5 Americans. One is the radio man. So the guy asked Tommy, he said, where all the Chamoru? He said, down there, he's pointing down at Menengon, you know. He said, okay, we like to take the Chamoru out. So the colonel asked us how long will it take us from there to down to the camp. Said, I'm going to give you 4 Marines to go. So we run down there. The commission, Phoenix Pangilinan was the commissioner at that time. So the 2 Japanese that came out from telling the commissioner to tell all the people to come out to get some ration, which is hand grenade. We were going down the hill, and Marian Sablan she hollered Japanese when we coming down the hill. Japanese, then she said, oh no, it's an American coming down the hill. And that American guy was a good shooter. He killed that 2 Jap in the other side, on the camp.
That part of the island was liberated that day, and many lives were saved. Babauta has lived through the reality of war. As a result, he had the motivation and determination to serve his country.
I like the American way of life then. I joined the Navy and I joined the Marine 2 times. I put in 4 years in the Navy, then I get out and I joined the Marine.
Babauta, now a retired veteran, remains patriotic to the country that saved him. For Joint Region Marianas, I'm Leah Clavea.
And so two stories from teenagers during the war. And so one of the things that has always struck me is, in my oral history, for those that I have talked to, I have spoken to some people who were in their 30s during the war, some who were in their 20s. But now it's increasingly difficult to find people who were in their teens during the war. And most of the living war survivors were young children, elementary school age, or even babies when the war started. And so it's important to keep this in mind, because the war story changes. The way that it is commemorated changes based on those who are telling the story, because they had very different experiences. And so, for example, in an article after World War II, and I always remember this because it was very sort of it had a huge impact on me when I saw it. In a random American newspaper talking about sort of the aftermath of World War II and the Japanese occupation in Guam, there is one quote by one Chamorro, who was an old man, who said that he preferred the Japanese to the Americans. And so that was something that struck me when I first read it, when I was in my early 20s, when I came across that article and was like, there's no way, no Chamorro could say this. But as I did more research and I learned more, I thought about it. You know, if this was an older Chamorro gentleman, he lived under the Spanish, he saw the Americans take over, he saw the Japanese take over, he saw the Americans come back. His experience of the war would have been fundamentally different. He may not have developed any sense of patriotism to the United States after the war. But those who were younger did, and those who were much younger definitely. So that's why when I would interview people who were in their 20s or 30s during the war, then you're talking to people who had children a lot of times during the war. Their experience changes too. The war is a stressful time, because your family is relying on you. You're trying to take care of others, for example, right? But as we get closer to those who are younger during the war, teenagers, it's still very traumatizing, right? Because for a lot of them, you are just on the edge where you might be forced to go and work in the fields. You might be forced to do this type of work because you are almost to that age where the Japanese have no qualms about treating you like that. But as we enter into the age when the war survivors that tell their stories were children during the war, the story changes once again. And so I appreciate sort of the sharing of both of these stories of Tunsus, Sitan Rosa, who were teenagers in the war, talking about their experience. We're going to move on now to a difficult part, the Fena Massacre. And so normally I try to stay away from the massacres when talking about World War II in Guam, because it's like, for example, Tinta and Faja, those are the stories that are told all the time, and they come to dominate sort of how we understand the Chamorro experience at that time. And we absolutely should tell those stories, although I think that if you're going to ever tell the Tinta and Faja stories, you should never tell them without telling the story of Atati and the Chamorros who fought back and saved their families by killing the Japanese. But Tinta and Faja, sort of the way that they are constantly repeated, the way that they come to stand in for the generalized Chamorro experience is problematic, because it means that the Chamorro is simply this suffering thing. That's what they're there for in history, that they just suffer. They're victims, right? And so it's important to tell that story, but you should never allow that to be the end of the story. And so the Fena Massacre, though, is somewhat different, because the Fena Massacre is, if you were to get into some grotesque sort of Olympics of oppression and atrocity, the Fena Massacre is probably the one that is the worst, which is the worst, because the massacres that we know about, they're focused on torture, brutalizing, killing. The Fena Massacre is the one in which sexual assault of women is a huge part of it, a huge horrific part of it. And one reason why the Fena Massacre does not get as much attention is because Tinta and Faja, for example, the details are pretty straightforward. 2 groups of 30 Chamorros are chosen, and then they are slaughtered, or almost slaughtered, by the Japanese. Fena is different, because there are people who were at the Fena Massacre who would deny that they were at the Fena Massacre. And there are still, if you talk to somebody who was there, then they will tell you wildly different things, because it wasn't one singular thing. It was something that prolonged, that took place over several days. And some people who died in it didn't die until days later. And so let's get into it. This is in July of 1944, before the Americans have invaded the island. And so when people are ordered to go to Menengan, the Taitso Takebana, sort of the head of the Japanese forces in Agate, puts out a notice, and there's differing stories of this. Some of it says that every family had to leave a young daughter behind, like a teenage or young woman daughter behind. Others say that they selected, but nonetheless, approximately 50 women were left behind in the village of Hagat to help the Japanese and serve the Japanese. An unknown number of men and young boys were also left behind, while the majority of the people from Hagat and Sumai were forced to march to Menengan. And the Taitso for the village told the people that, Hagatna's lost, the Americans are about to invade. We will protect you and we will keep you safe. Take care of us and we will reward you. after the war is over and there's peace, you will be rewarded for taking care of us. And so the group of men and women, Chamorros, were taken into the Fena area where there's a number of caves. And and in one of the caves, women were brought. They were told, they were given sake, or they were given treats, and they were told to serve the soldiers and make the soldiers happy, and then the soldiers would protect them. And for one night, the women were raped repeatedly by those soldiers. In other caves, other people were gathered, and in some of those caves, people were murdered and killed. Even those who survived or were still alive, there's stories of grenades being thrown into caves to finish them off, so Japanese soldiers going in to bayonet everyone. And even if you survived the caves and left, some people were cut down escaping the caves. They were cut down by the Japanese, or they were killed by American bombs or by American bullets. And so this is why the Fena Cave Massacre is the most horrific, but also one of the least discussed, is because of the nebulous nature of it. Because some people may have died as part of this massacre, and we don't know. And because of the horrific experiences that some people had, there are those, in particular women, who claimed that they were not there, even though they might have been there or they were there. And so this is why this is the most complicated of the massacres to talk about, because of the shame and the stigma for women who were sexually assaulted and raped during the war, how those stories did not get passed on for obvious reasons, right? Another reason why, but anyways, so the stories that you are about to hear were collected as part of the year 2000 memorial mass and memorial ceremony for the Fena massacre victims and survivors. And so these were compiled and put into a program, and then they are sort of the experiences of some of the survivors of the Fena Cave Massacre talking about what they saw and what they experienced. And so, Nita Taita Esticia. Jose Cruz first. Jose Cruz remembers about 100 people inside the cave with him. He remembers it being 45 feet deep and 18 to 20 feet wide. His older brother, Pedro, quietly told him not to go in too far. He lay down and heard the sound of machine guns firing. He was wounded on the leg, shoulder, feet, back, and lap. By the time the bayoneting started, he was well into the back, crawling through a back entrance. He passed out. Eventually, he returned to the cave only to find the dead and wounded. Aidzus, they are still alive, but they can't move. And so the fact that these types of massacres happened in caves is cruel, but it did save some people because of the darkness, because of the ability to escape into other caverns. And so what Jose Cruz remembered about when he was in the Fena Cave Massacre. This is an account that is not attributed to anybody in particular. In the program, it is just given as one woman said this. Another group of about 12 women were ordered into another cave. One woman hid deep in the cave and watched as her neighbors and friends were repeatedly raped by the Japanese soldiers. She heard them crying. When it was all over, a few women escaped. Some of the women waited in the cave until morning. The woman who watched the rapes left the next day with 5 other women, but she was unable to keep up with them. She later watched their beheading. And so this is what I spoke about earlier, is that even for those who survived, if you were in the jungle and out in the open and not at Menengan where you were supposed to be, the Japanese would kill you, accuse you of helping the Americans, or that you were trying to help the Americans, or that if they left you alive, you would help the Americans. And so, yes, so not everybody involved in the Fena Cave Massacre dies within those caves, that an unknown number escape and die within minutes, within hours, or within days of the initial killing and raping taking place. Oh, yeah. From Rosa Garrido. Rosa Garrido had barely become a teenager when she was sent into a cave with 4 other women. She saw men in other caves. The women were ordered to sit down. We did not know what to do. We did not know what they were going to do. We had no suspicion they would shoot us. The Japanese began firing machine guns, and she watched 2 sisters fall and roll into the lost river in the cave. Wounded, she crawled toward the river and hid under a bridge until early morning. Unable to stand, she crawled to another cave where she stayed for several days. And so, first, for the survivors, you can see why, for some of them, they might want to put it behind them. Because even if you survive the initial massacre, you might be in hiding in a cave or somewhere in the jungle for days, worrying that you're going to be found and worrying that if somebody does find you, you're dead. Maria Muñoz San Nicolas. Maria Muñoz San Nicolas was a child of 10 when she would become part of the massacre. Today, she is known as Maria Chong Alerta. It all began as her family joined a group of people ordered to go to Menengan. Some Japanese soldiers picked us out of a group. They said they had something for my father to do. Her father, Jose Choco San Nicolas, was a cattleman and well-liked by his Japanese boss, Indo. He tried in vain to reason with the Japanese as he was accompanying his 4 children, ranging in age from 4 to 10, Maria being the oldest. All night, the small group accompanied by Anna Nedidog walked until they came to a cave. They told us to stop and take a rest. They had been joined by a group of boys. They said, we are to rest in that cave until the following day. She said the Japanese insisted on the young children entering first in what may have been an attempt to let them live. The caves sloped down. I think that is what saved us. Later, the Japanese walked in to bayonet any moving bodies. The 4 children lay very still and were passed over by a soldier. In the end, only her father was wounded superficially with a bayonet. It was another cave that would save them. After wandering around the jungle for days, they ran into the James family from Tamuning, who had been hiding in a cave for some time. They stayed with them for a week. Boy. And so there is another reason why. And so one of the people who worked hard, at least in my memory, because I did interview him and I did accompany him on different memorials for the Fena Cave Massacre. He's right here, the late Speaker of the Guam Legislature, y Legislatura en Guahan, Tony Ampinco. And so one reason why this massacre is not as well known and not given as much attention is for the reasons I've already mentioned, but another reason is because Fena is on a Navy base. It is behind Navy fences. And so there have been times, for example, when memorials have been planned to go to the site and the Navy has not allowed people onto the base. Even people where they arranged it with the Navy ahead of time and then the Navy decided at the last second to cancel and prevent them from entering. And so this is one reason why I like to tell this story about Fena, even though it is difficult, is because you do not want these stories and these places to be lost, subsumed within military property, right? It's happened to so many places already on this island. And it's unfortunate that this story, these terrifying experiences, the survival of these Chamorros does not receive as much attention because of the fact, not just because of the difficulty in telling the story, but because of the fact that people cannot freely go there to see the areas, to pay respects, to light candles, right? And so the tragic story, complicated story of the Fena Cave Massacre. As a final sort of story, I want to change things completely, because one of the things that happens in the war is, of course, that as people are focused on survival, some of the things which Chamorros kind of lived and breathed by, it's still there, but it is less emphasized in their telling of their war story, because the thinking is that these sorts of things don't matter. What matters is the brutality of the Japanese and the suffering of the people. And so one of the things, interestingly enough, that I've noticed that is there but gets strongly de-emphasized is Taotaomo'na stories. Is that it is very rare to hear Chamorros share Taotaomo'na stories from the war, because it doesn't seem like something that you're supposed to share from that time. But Taotaomo'na, especially, especially in the absence of all of the other ways in which Chamorros might pass the time, right? Even just listening to the radio, maybe going to a movie, just gathering freely and socializing, these things were not allowed, which meant that some of the older ways, even storytelling, folklore, legends, these things could have been revived as a way to pass time, as a way to distract, right? Or even just as a way of psychologically dealing with things, that the Taotaomo'na may represent something else, right? Symbolically. And so this is a Taotaomo'na story from the Japanese occupation, from the village of Malesso. And so the woman who gives the story, her name is not given. The woman who tells the story, her name is not given. But Malesso during the Japanese occupation. I was about 14 at that time. I went to church for a special youth group meeting. This was a hard time, and the meeting was the only fun we had in those days. I hoped to meet Jose Cruz, whom I really liked. He didn't show up, and I was disappointed. When I left church, another fellow asked to walk me home. Since I had to walk past an area where there were soldiers staying, I wanted someone to walk with me. But I knew that if I allowed him to walk me home, my real boyfriend, Jose, would find out about it and get mad. So I decided to walk alone. It was a long walk. My family was staying out at our ranch. So first off, I like this just because this is during the Japanese occupation. It's not safe. But this young woman feels different types of pressures. She's afraid of a soldier harassing her or worse. She doesn't want to walk home alone, but she also doesn't want to accept being walked home by somebody who's not her boyfriend. But in truth, Jose Cruz is probably also her secret boyfriend, that they're meeting secretly and talking secretly, and they're not because they're not allowed to date at this time. And so for me, that just shows sort of that even in the most terrible times, sort of life goes on, or that sort of life happens, and it's okay for us to think about it and remember it. This is one of the ways that people survive, is that if you're stuck in this position in which you have so little control and there's so many threats of violence around you, terror, right? Do you just, this is one way that you can diffuse that feeling, or sort of just kind of take a little bit of the sting out of it, right? A way of dealing with it is to focus on these other types of things. And so that's one thing that I appreciate about this story. As I walked home, I felt that someone was following me. But when I looked behind me, I could not see or hear anything. I was fearful that it was a soldier. I began to walk a little faster. The faster I walked, the louder were the sounds from the person following me. Each time I looked back, nothing was there, and I could not hear a thing. I was frightened and thought that it must be a Taotaomo'na. Finally, I wasn't just walking faster, I was running as fast as I could. I was praying to the Virgin Mary to protect me. I didn't stop running or praying, even when I reached our house. I ran up the steps and into the house to our family altar, where we had some candles burning. I knelt down and thanked Mary for saving me. My family all began to tease me. They said, "Look at Jesusa. It was not enough to just go to church and pray. She's trying to shame us by acting so holy." They stopped the teasing when they saw how frightened I was, but they said it was just my imagination. They said that nothing was following me. I love this part. Because remember, this is the wartime. A young daughter comes home and she's like this, and she's scared. She goes to pray. And of course, the family teases her. You think you're better than us? I love that part. But let's hear the conclusion to this story. The next morning, when we went out to our field to hoe the corn, the whole family was shocked. There were 2 rows of corn completely knocked down. Had this been done by the wind, it would have been all the rows knocked down. My father said, maybe it was a wild pig or the carabao. When we looked for tracks, we found human-like footprints, but they were 2 feet long and about 10 inches wide. Since then, my family has never doubted me, and I have never since forgotten to ask the Taotaomo'na's permission to pass along the trail that leads to our ranch. My father said that the Taotaomo'na did not intend to harm me. He was only making sure I made it home safe. He was just a little mad that I had not shown proper respect. I felt the only thing that saved me was my prayers. And so at the end, what I really like about this story is that the person telling it sort of is reminding us that their prayers to the Virgin Mary saved them. But what I love is just this idea that the Father dispenses the wisdom that, the Taotaomo'na wasn't scaring you or hurting you. The Taotaomo'na was making sure you were safe. And that is something that's interesting, right? Because first of all, it's most stories of Taotaomo'na that we have today deal with them as troublesome, malevolent spirits that harass, that punish, right? Here is one in which the Father is acknowledging and saying, oh my goodness, you didn't respect the Taotaomo'na. The Taotaomo'na just wanted to make sure you were okay. And for those of you who have ever heard me talk about the Taotaomo'na before, remember that even the phrase itself is something that comes about after colonization has begun, after the Chamorro-Spanish Wars are over, and after Chamorros have started to lose and adapt their pre-Catholic beliefs. So Chamorros believed in the Aniti, the spirits of their ancestors. They believed that the spirits of the ancestors helped them and protected them. The Taotaomo'na is an adaptation of that, but it's one in which the intimacy that Chamorros feel to them has been disrupted or has been put at a further distance, where you respect the Taotaomo'na, but they're not your family. They're the ancient ancestors, the people from way before. What I love about this story, though, is that it's a reminder that the Taotaomo'na, in addition to performing sort of the function, the scary movie function, they also protect Chamorros. And that the Father here recognizes that this is not something that I'm saying today and making it up, that this is something that Chamorros before the war, during the war, understood, is that there are Chamorros who protect us. There are Taotaomo'na who protect us. And so I find the story to be cute. I find it to be a very different perspective on the Taotaomo'na. And that's why I love to share this story. And so, Puede Adzan Midzu este episode. I hope that you found this episode to be very interesting, that maybe you learned something from it. If you've made it all the way to the end of the episode, remember, put fabot, you can comment and let me know other Chamorro War survivor stories that you might want to hear. Share some Chamorro War survivor stories from your own family. But yes, just let me know if you want more episodes like this, because I love to be able to put these things that I've collected, that I have learned, out there into the world. Enoha para pago si dus masi put in kungok zanine ega este ajos este kimana lihitalo.